Captain Daniel Walker returned home at 3:47 in the morning on June 14, 2022, 17 hours earlier than expected from a security consultation in San Antonio, and discovered his wife Emily naked in their marital bed with his closest friend Major Robert Hayes, the same man who had saved his life during an ambush in Kandahar 9 years earlier, the same man who had stood as best man at their wedding, the same man Daniel had trusted with every secret and vulnerability accumulated across 2 decades of brotherhood forged in the most brutal conditions imaginable. The discovery lasted approximately 4 seconds before Daniel retrieved his service pistol from the hallway safe, returned to the bedroom, and fired 11 rounds with the mechanical precision of a trained soldier executing a combat mission, killing both his wife and his best friend, while they scrambled desperately to cover themselves and beg for mercy that would never come from a man whose entire identity had been constructed around loyalty, honor, and the absolute sanctity of trust between warriors and between husband and wife. The crime scene that Austin Police Department homicide detectives discovered 6 hours later would haunt even the most experienced investigators, not because of unusual brutality or gore, but because of the disturbing calmness and military efficiency evident in every detail of the execution. Daniel had made no attempt to flee or destroy evidence, instead sitting calmly in his living room with the weapon disassembled on the coffee table beside him, drinking scotch and waiting for police arrival with the same composed discipline he had demonstrated throughout his military career when awaiting extraction after completing dangerous missions in hostile territory. The precision of the shooting pattern indicated someone who had maintained complete emotional control despite the psychological devastation of discovering his wife's infidelity with his closest friend, each bullet placed with surgical accuracy in ways that suggested professional training rather than crimes of passion committed by civilians who typically displayed erratic aim and excessive force born from panic and emotional chaos. Daniel Walker's background as a decorated Army captain who had served 2 grueling tours in Afghanistan made the case immediately complicated for prosecutors who would need to balance his military service and documented PTSD against the premeditated nature of his actions and his failure to demonstrate any remorse during initial questioning. His military records documented 17 confirmed combat engagements, 3 commendations for valor under fire, and psychological evaluations that noted increasing difficulty with anger management and emotional regulation following his return to civilian life in 2018 after 12 years of active service that had begun when he enlisted at age 22, immediately after college graduation, with dreams of serving his country and building a career defined by honor and sacrifice. Emily Walker's background as a compassionate nurse who had devoted her career to helping vulnerable patients at a private clinic specializing in trauma recovery made her death particularly tragic for colleagues and family members who struggled to reconcile the vibrant, caring woman they knew with someone who would betray her marriage vows by engaging in an affair with her husband's closest friend. Her sister Maria would later testify that Emily had confided feeling emotionally abandoned by Daniel, whose PTSD symptoms and difficulty adjusting to civilian life had created distance in their marriage, despite her efforts to provide support and understanding for the trauma he had experienced during military service that had fundamentally changed his personality and emotional availability. Robert Hayes's position as Daniel's former commanding officer and the man credited with saving Daniel's life during a Taliban ambush in 2013 added layers of betrayal that would become central to understanding the psychological devastation that had motivated the murders. Military records documented that Robert had risked his own life to drag a wounded Daniel to safety under heavy fire, an act of heroism that had created a debt Daniel believed could never be repaid, and a bond he considered more sacred than biological family connections. The revelation that this same man had been sleeping with his wife represented not merely romantic betrayal but the destruction of everything Daniel had constructed his identity around during 2 decades of military service, where loyalty between soldiers was considered the highest virtue and betrayal the most unforgivable sin. The 911 call that brought police to the Walker residence came not from Daniel, but from a neighbor who had heard gunshots and Emily's brief screams before. Silence descended over the upscale Austin neighborhood where young professionals and military veterans had built comfortable lives far removed from the chaos and violence that many had experienced overseas. The responding officers found Daniel sitting calmly with his hands visible, offering no resistance to arrest and providing a detailed confession that demonstrated complete awareness of his actions and their legal consequences, showing none of the confusion or emotional distress typically displayed by individuals who claimed temporary insanity or loss of control during violent confrontations. The weapons analysis would later confirm that all 11 rounds had been fired from Daniel's legally registered Beretta M9, the same model he had carried during military service, with ammunition purchased legally from a sporting goods store 3 months earlier, for what he had described to the clerk as target practice at a local range where he maintained his shooting proficiency. The ballistics evidence indicated that Daniel had fired 6 rounds into Robert and 5 into Emily, with each shot placed in ways that suggested deliberate lethality rather than warning shots or attempts to wound, demonstrating the cold efficiency of someone executing a mission rather than acting in the heat of passion or temporary emotional breakdown that defense attorneys might later claim had compromised his judgment and criminal responsibility. The timeline reconstruction would reveal that Daniel had arrived home much earlier than expected because his San Antonio consultation had been canceled at the last minute due to his client's scheduling conflict, a random occurrence that neither Emily nor Robert could have anticipated when they had believed themselves safe to continue their affair in the privacy of Daniel's home while he was supposed to be away overnight. The cruel irony that a simple scheduling change had led to the discovery and subsequent murders would haunt everyone connected to the case, raising unanswerable questions about fate and the fragile circumstances that separated ordinary life from devastating tragedy in ways that seemed arbitrary and senseless. The investigation into the double homicide began with Detective Carla Ruiz's arrival at the Walker residence at 9:37 on that bright June morning, where she immediately recognized the distinctive characteristics of a crime committed by someone with military training rather than a civilian acting in emotional frenzy. The bodies of Emily Walker and Robert Hayes remained in the master bedroom exactly where they had fallen, the bedding soaked with blood, but the surrounding room showing no signs of struggle or chaos, indicating that the victims had been given no opportunity to defend themselves or escape before Daniel had executed them with the mechanical efficiency he had learned during years of combat operations where hesitation could mean death. The forensic analysis of the crime scene documented that Emily had been shot 3 times in the chest and twice in the head, while Robert had received 4 chest wounds and 2 headshots, each following the standard double-tap technique taught in military training, where shooters are instructed to ensure target neutralization through multiple center mass hits, followed by headshots to guarantee lethality. The pattern suggested that Daniel had maintained complete emotional control throughout the shooting, systematically executing both victims rather than firing wildly in rage or confusion, as would be expected from someone experiencing the temporary insanity that his defense team would later claim had compromised his criminal responsibility. The interrogation of Daniel Walker lasted 7 hours and produced a detailed confession that demonstrated his complete awareness of his actions and their legal and moral consequences, with no indication of remorse or emotional breakdown that might support claims of diminished capacity or temporary insanity during the commission of the murders. Daniel explained calmly that he had returned home early from San Antonio, entered his house through the front door using his key, and immediately heard sounds from the bedroom that made the nature of what was occurring unmistakably clear to someone who had been married for 6 years and knew intimately the sounds of his wife's intimate activities. The psychological devastation Daniel described experiencing during those few seconds between recognition and action would become central to understanding his motivations and mental state, though it would prove insufficient to establish the legal insanity defense that his attorneys would attempt. Daniel told detectives that discovering Emily with Robert represented not merely sexual betrayal, but the complete destruction of every value and relationship he had built his entire adult life around. The revelation that the 2 people he trusted most in the world had systematically deceived him while he worked to provide for his family and maintain the friendship bonds that had sustained him through the darkest periods of combat service overseas. The confession included Daniel's acknowledgement that he had made a conscious decision to retrieve his weapon and return to the bedroom rather than confronting the couple verbally or leaving the house to process his emotions, demonstrating the premeditation that would prove crucial for prosecutors seeking first-degree murder convictions rather than lesser charges based on heat of passion or temporary emotional disturbance. Daniel explained that military training had conditioned him to respond to threats with immediate decisive action, rather than negotiation or retreat, and that in the moment of discovery, his brain had classified the situation as requiring the same type of terminal response he had employed against enemy combatants who had threatened him and his fellow soldiers during combat operations in Afghanistan. The investigation into the affair between Emily and Robert revealed that their relationship had begun approximately 8 months before the murders, developing gradually from innocent emotional support into physical intimacy that both participants had initially resisted due to their loyalty to Daniel and awareness of the devastating consequences discovery would bring. Text messages and emails recovered from their phones documented the evolution of their relationship from sympathetic conversations about Daniel's PTSD symptoms and emotional distance to explicit sexual communications and careful planning of encounters during times when Daniel would be away from home for work commitments or visiting his elderly mother in Houston. The psychological profile of Emily that investigators developed through interviews with family, friends, and colleagues painted a picture of a woman trapped between loyalty to a husband she had once loved deeply and desperation for emotional connection that Daniel's trauma and emotional unavailability had made impossible within their marriage. Her sister Maria testified that Emily had confided feeling guilty about the affair, but also described feeling alive again after years of walking on eggshells around Daniel's unpredictable moods and violent outbursts that had never been physically directed at her, but had created an atmosphere of tension and fear that had eroded the intimacy and trust essential for healthy marital relationships. The background investigation into Robert Hayes revealed a more complex motivation for betraying his closest friend, with evidence suggesting that he had been in love with Emily for years, but had suppressed these feelings out of loyalty to Daniel until Emily's obvious unhappiness and explicit interest made resistance increasingly difficult. Former colleagues testified that Robert had always been protective of Emily during social gatherings, defending her when Daniel made critical comments, and providing emotional support during periods when Daniel's PTSD symptoms were particularly severe, and his behavior toward Emily was dismissive or hostile in ways that made friends uncomfortable witnessing. The military connection between Daniel and Robert added dimensions to the betrayal that civilian observers struggled to fully comprehend, as the bond between soldiers who had served together in combat was considered sacred in military culture, and Robert's betrayal represented violation of codes that transcended civilian concepts of friendship, loyalty. Testimony from their former squad members documented that Robert had literally saved Daniel's life during a Taliban ambush in Kandahar province in 2013, dragging him to safety while under heavy fire, and providing medical care that prevented Daniel from bleeding to death before evacuation helicopters arrived, creating a debt that Daniel believed could never be repaid, and made Robert's subsequent betrayal even more devastating and incomprehensible. The forensic timeline established that the affair had been conducted with careful planning to avoid discovery, with Emily and Robert meeting primarily during Daniel's business trips or at Robert's apartment across town, rather than risking encounters in the Walker home where neighbors or unexpected returns might expose their relationship. The fatal decision to meet in Daniel and Emily's marital bed had been made because Robert's apartment was being fumigated, and Emily had believed Daniel would be in San Antonio overnight, a miscalculation based on false confidence in predictable schedules that had worked successfully during previous encounters, but had failed catastrophically when Daniel's business meeting was unexpectedly canceled. The reaction from Daniel's family was immediate and complicated, with his elderly mother Linda publicly defending her son while expressing devastation about Emily's death and the destruction of the life Daniel had worked so hard to build after returning from military service. Linda testified that Daniel had always been a good man who had been fundamentally changed by military service and the trauma of combat experiences that had left him emotionally scarred and struggling to adjust to civilian life, where the clear rules and strong bonds of military culture were absent, leaving him vulnerable to betrayals that someone with his values and background found literally incomprehensible and psychologically devastating. The formal charges against Daniel Walker were filed 48 hours after the murders, with prosecutors pursuing 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances based on the premeditated nature of the killings and Daniel's military training that had enabled him to execute both victims with professional efficiency. despite any emotional distress he may have been experiencing during the critical moments when he made the decision to retrieve his weapon and return to the bedroom to kill, rather than confronting the situation through non-lethal means. The decision to seek first-degree convictions rather than accepting lesser pleas based on heat of passion or diminished capacity reflected the prosecutor's assessment that Daniel's military background and the methodical nature of his actions demonstrated conscious decision-making rather than temporary insanity or loss of control that might justify reduced charges. The bail hearing attracted significant media attention, as defense attorneys argued that Daniel's military service, lack of criminal history, and cooperation with investigators justified release pending trial, while prosecutors countered that his combat training and demonstrated capacity for lethal violence made him an unacceptable risk to public safety, regardless of his previous good character and service to his country. Judge Margaret Harrison ultimately denied bail after reviewing crime scene photographs and hearing testimony from forensic psychologists who testified that Daniel's emotional flatness during interrogation and lack of remorse suggested personality changes consistent with combat trauma that made his future behavior unpredictable and potentially dangerous if he were released into community settings where he might encounter situations triggering similar violent responses. The defense strategy emerged gradually as Daniel's attorneys recognized that traditional self-defense claims were impossible given the circumstances of the discovery, and that their best hope for avoiding life imprisonment required establishing that combat-related PTSD had compromised Daniel's capacity for rational decision-making during the critical seconds between discovery and violence. The defense team hired military psychologists and trauma experts who would testify that years of combat conditioning had created automatic threat response patterns that Daniel could not consciously control when confronted with situations his brain interpreted as betrayals equivalent to enemy attacks, requiring immediate decisive action to eliminate threats to his psychological survival. The prosecution's case was built around demonstrating premeditation through Daniel's decision to leave the bedroom, retrieve his weapon, and return to execute both victims, rather than responding immediately in the heat of discovery, arguing that these actions demonstrated conscious decision-making and deliberate choice rather than automatic responses driven by trauma or temporary emotional breakdown. Prosecutors presented timeline analysis, showing that at least 45 seconds elapsed between Daniel's initial discovery and the first shots, providing sufficient time for rational thought and alternative choices that Daniel had consciously rejected in favor of lethal violence, that his military training had made easily accessible and brutally efficient. The victim impact statements from Emily's family were emotionally devastating, with her mother describing the daughter she had raised to be compassionate and caring, someone who had devoted her life to healing others through her nursing career and who had made a terrible mistake in judgment but did not deserve to die for seeking emotional connection and intimacy that her marriage had failed to provide, due to Daniel's trauma and emotional unavailability. Emily's sister Maria testified that Emily had confided wanting to leave the marriage but feeling trapped by financial dependence and fear of Daniel's reaction given his increasingly volatile moods and violent outbursts directed at inanimate objects during arguments about trivial domestic matters that seemed to trigger disproportionate rage responses. The testimony from Robert's widow, Jennifer, was particularly heartbreaking, as she described discovering that her husband of 20 years had been conducting an affair while maintaining the facade of a happy marriage and strong friendship with Daniel. Jennifer's victim statement included her struggle to reconcile the man she had loved and trusted with someone capable of such devastating betrayal of his closest friend, acknowledging that Robert's actions had been deeply wrong, while also asserting that his mistakes did not justify execution without trial or opportunity for redemption, and that Daniel had destroyed not only 2 lives but also devastated multiple families through his decision to respond to betrayal with murder rather than divorce and legal accountability. The forensic psychology testimony became central to both prosecution and defense strategies, with competing experts offering contradictory interpretations of Daniel's mental state during the murders and his capacity for rational decision-making, given his documented PTSD symptoms and combat trauma history. Defense expert Dr. Michael Bradford testified that Daniel's brain had been fundamentally rewired by years of combat experience, where survival required immediate violent responses to perceived threats, creating automatic reaction patterns that Daniel could not consciously control when confronted with the devastating betrayal represented by discovering his wife with his closest friend in circumstances that triggered trauma responses, conditioning him to eliminate threats before they could harm him. The prosecution's expert, Dr. Sarah Chen, countered that while Daniel's PTSD was real and debilitating, the evidence clearly demonstrated conscious decision-making and rational thought during the critical period between discovery and violence, pointing to Daniel's choice to retrieve his weapon rather than using something immediately available. His systematic execution of both victims, using professional military technique, and his calm behavior afterward, as proof that he had maintained cognitive control throughout the incident, regardless of his emotional distress. Dr. Chen testified that many individuals with PTSD managed to avoid violence despite triggering situations, and that Daniel's military training actually increased rather than decreased his responsibility because it had provided him with an enhanced capacity for controlled violence that he had consciously chosen to employ against unarmed victims who posed no actual physical threat to his safety. The testimony from Daniel's former military colleagues provided complex perspectives on his character and mental state, with several soldiers describing him as a dedicated officer who had cared deeply about his subordinates and demonstrated exceptional bravery under fire, while also noting personality changes following his return to civilian life that included increased anger, social withdrawal, and obsessive concerns about loyalty and betrayal that seemed disproportionate to normal civilian relationship challenges. Sergeant Michael Adams testified that Daniel had confided during a reunion dinner 6 months before the murders that he suspected Emily might be having an affair, but that he could not imagine his best friend Robert would betray him in such a devastating way, suggesting that Daniel had been aware of potential infidelity, but had consciously chosen to trust Robert despite warning signs that might have prompted other husbands to investigate or confront their suspicions directly. The defense's attempt to introduce evidence about Robert's past romantic interest in Emily was partially successful, with the judge allowing testimony that Robert had confided to fellow soldiers during deployment that he found Emily attractive and admired her compassion, while excluding more speculative claims that Robert had pursued friendship with Daniel partially to maintain proximity to Emily. This evidence supported the defense narrative that the betrayal had been particularly devastating because it represented not opportunistic infidelity, but rather long-term deception by someone who had befriended Daniel while harboring romantic feelings for his wife, making the betrayal more calculated and psychologically damaging than a spontaneous affair between strangers would have been. The financial investigation revealed that Emily had been preparing to leave the marriage, having consulted with divorce attorneys 3 weeks before her death, and having begun separating financial accounts in ways that suggested she was planning to file for divorce, but had delayed because she wanted to ensure Robert would be willing to commit to a relationship before she abandoned the financial security her marriage provided. This evidence complicated the victim narrative, while also supporting prosecution arguments that Emily's affair had been winding toward a natural conclusion through legal divorce, rather than requiring violent intervention to resolve, and that Daniel's decision to murder both participants represented rage and vengeance, rather than necessary protection of his interests or person. The jury selection process took 3 weeks, as attorneys on both sides sought jurors who could balance sympathy for military service and PTSD awareness, with recognition that combat trauma did not provide unlimited license for violence against civilians who posed no actual physical threat. The final jury included several veterans who defense attorneys hoped would understand combat conditioning, along with civilians who prosecutors believed would recognize that military training increased rather than decreased culpability for violence, executed with professional precision against unarmed victims who were given no opportunity to defend themselves or escape before Daniel systematically executed them in their most vulnerable moments. The trial of Daniel Walker began on March 6, 2023, in an Austin courtroom packed with media representatives, family members from all sides, and members of the military veteran community who viewed the case as having significant implications for how society would judge soldiers struggling to reintegrate into civilian life after years of combat service that had fundamentally changed their neurological responses to perceived threats and betrayals. The opening statements from both prosecution and defense attorneys established competing narratives about whether Daniel should be understood as a decorated soldier whose combat trauma had compromised his capacity for rational decision-making, or as a calculated murderer who had used his military training to execute two unarmed people who had betrayed his trust but posed no actual physical threat requiring lethal response. The prosecution's opening statement focused relentlessly on the premeditated nature of Daniel's actions and the professional execution style that demonstrated conscious control rather than temporary emotional breakdown, with lead prosecutor James Morrison describing in graphic detail how Daniel had left the bedroom, where he discovered his wife and best friend, walked to the hallway safe, retrieved his service weapon, loaded it with practiced efficiency, and returned to systematically shoot both victims multiple times using the same combat techniques he had employed against enemy combatants overseas. Morrison emphasized that at least 45 seconds had elapsed between discovery and the first shots, providing ample time for Daniel to choose alternative responses, including leaving the house, calling police, or confronting the couple verbally, rather than executing them without trial or opportunity for explanation or mercy. The defense opening statement painted Daniel as a victim of both combat trauma and devastating betrayal, with attorney Rebecca Hartman describing how years of military service in the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan had rewired Daniel's brain to respond to perceived threats with immediate violent action that had kept him alive during countless combat engagements, but had become maladaptive in civilian contexts where threats were emotional rather than physical. Hartman emphasized Daniel's exemplary military record, his documented PTSD symptoms, and the psychological devastation of discovering that the two people he trusted most had systematically betrayed him while he struggled to build a civilian life, despite trauma that made every day a battle against memories and conditioned responses that civilian society neither understood nor adequately supported through veteran services. The testimony from Detective Carla Ruiz provided the jury with detailed documentation of the crime scene and Daniel's behavior during arrest and interrogation, including his calm demeanor, detailed confession, and complete lack of remorse or emotional breakdown that might indicate temporary insanity or inability to understand the wrongfulness of his actions. Ruiz described finding Daniel sitting peacefully in his living room, with his weapon disassembled on the coffee table, drinking scotch, and waiting for police arrival with the same disciplined patience he had demonstrated during military operations, showing no signs of the panic or guilt typically displayed by individuals who had just killed family members in moments of uncontrolled passion or temporary emotional disturbance. The forensic pathologist testimony provided gruesome details about the nature and extent of the victim's injuries, with Dr. Thomas Chen describing how each bullet had been placed with surgical precision in ways that ensured rapid death, while also demonstrating the systematic nature of the execution, rather than wild firing that might suggest loss of control. The autopsy reports documented that Emily had been shot 5 times, with 3 bullets striking her chest and 2 her head, while Robert had received 6 shots distributed between chest and head in patterns consistent with military training rather than civilian panic firing, supporting prosecution arguments that Daniel had maintained complete cognitive control throughout the shooting, regardless of his emotional state. The crime scene photographs shown to the jury were deliberately graphic, with prosecutors emphasizing the vulnerability of the victims who had been caught completely unprepared and given no opportunity to defend themselves or escape before Daniel executed them with professional efficiency. The images showed Emily's body sprawled across the bed where, moments earlier, she had been engaged in intimate activity with Robert, whose body lay partially on the floor, where he had apparently attempted to rise and confront Daniel before being shot multiple times in rapid succession that prevented any defensive action or plea for mercy that might have interrupted Daniel's systematic execution of both targets. The testimony from Emily's sister Maria was emotionally devastating as she described her sister's unhappiness in the marriage and her confession weeks before her death that she had been having an affair with Robert because he provided the emotional intimacy and attention that Daniel's trauma and emotional distance had made impossible within their marriage. Maria testified that Emily had expressed guilt about the affair, but also described feeling trapped in a marriage to someone whose PTSD symptoms and volatile moods had created an atmosphere of tension where she felt unable to be herself or express needs without triggering angry responses that, while never physically violent toward her, had created fear and emotional distance that had gradually eroded the love and connection they had initially shared. The cross-examination of Maria by defense attorney Hartman attempted to establish that Emily's decision to conduct the affair rather than seeking marital counseling or filing for divorce demonstrated poor judgment and insensitivity to Daniel's combat trauma and needs, with Hartman suggesting that Emily had contributed to the tragedy through selfish choices that had devastated a man who was already struggling with reintegration challenges that his wife should have supported rather than compounded through betrayal with his closest friend. This line of questioning drew objections from prosecutors and criticism from victims' advocates, who argued that defense attempts to blame Emily for her own murder represented dangerous victim blaming that ignored Daniel's sole responsibility for choosing violence over legal alternatives. The testimony from military psychologist Dr. Michael Bradford provided the theoretical foundation for the defense's PTSD-based argument, with Bradford explaining how combat experience fundamentally rewired neurological pathways to prioritize survival through immediate violent responses to perceived threats. Bradford testified that Daniel's brain had been conditioned through years of combat where hesitation meant death to respond automatically to betrayal and threat with decisive action, and that discovering his wife with his best friend had triggered trauma responses that bypassed conscious rational thought and activated survival mechanisms that classified the situation as requiring immediate elimination of threats to his psychological and social survival within military culture, where betrayal by fellow soldiers was considered equivalent to combat treachery. The prosecution's rebuttal witness, Dr. Sarah Chen, systematically dismantled the defense's PTSD argument by emphasizing that while combat trauma was real and debilitating, it did not eliminate conscious choice or moral responsibility for violence against unarmed civilians who posed no actual physical threat. Chen testified that thousands of combat veterans with PTSD managed to avoid violence despite triggering situations, and that Daniel's ability to retrieve his weapon, load it properly, return to the bedroom, and systematically execute both victims using professional technique demonstrated cognitive control and conscious decision-making, rather than automatic trauma responses that would have resulted in more chaotic and less precise violence. The testimony from Robert's widow, Jennifer, provided a different dimension of victim impact, describing the man she had loved for 20 years and the devastation of learning posthumously about his affair with Emily, while also emphasizing that his mistakes did not justify execution without trial or opportunity for redemption. Jennifer testified that she would never forgive Robert for his betrayal, but that Daniel had stolen not only her husband's life, but also her opportunity to process the affair, confront Robert, and make choices about their marriage based on honest information, rather than being forced into permanent widowhood through violence that had solved nothing while destroying multiple families and leaving children without fathers who, despite their flaws, had been loving parents who deserved consequences, proportionate to their actions rather than death sentences executed by someone with no legal authority to judge or punish. The character witnesses for Daniel included former military colleagues who testified about his bravery, dedication, and leadership during combat operations, painting a picture of someone who had served his country with distinction and had saved numerous lives through decisive action under fire. Sergeant Michael Adams described Daniel as someone who had always put his soldiers first and had demonstrated exceptional courage during a particularly brutal firefight in Kandahar province, where Daniel had exposed himself to enemy fire to recover wounded soldiers, earning a Bronze Star for valor that represented genuine heroism rather than routine military service. These testimonies were designed to humanize Daniel and remind the jury of his contributions and sacrifices before civilian life and betrayal had triggered the violence that had brought him to trial. The defense presentation of evidence about Robert's long-term attraction to Emily was designed to support arguments that the betrayal had been particularly devastating because it represented not opportunistic infidelity, calculated deception by someone who had befriended Daniel specifically to maintain proximity to Emily while harboring romantic feelings that he had eventually acted upon when Emily's unhappiness made her vulnerable to his attention. Text messages between Robert and Emily revealed that Robert had confessed being attracted to Emily for years, supporting defense claims that Daniel had been betrayed by someone whose entire friendship might have been partially motivated by inappropriate feelings for his wife, making the discovery even more psychologically devastating than typical marital infidelity would have been. The psychological testimony phase of the trial extended over 2 weeks, as competing experts debated whether Daniel's combat trauma had compromised his capacity for rational decision-making during the critical moments between discovering the affair and executing both victims. The defense's primary expert witness, Dr. Michael Bradford, presented extensive research on combat conditioning and neurological changes in soldiers exposed to repeated life-threatening situations where survival required immediate violent responses to perceived threats without time for careful deliberation about proportionality or alternatives to lethal force that civilian life assumes people can always access regardless of their training and trauma history. Dr. Bradford testified that Daniel's brain had been fundamentally altered by years of combat experience, where the difference between survival and death often depended on recognizing threats within milliseconds and responding with decisive, lethal force before enemies could exploit hesitation or moral uncertainty. Bradford explained that these neurological changes were not temporary emotional disturbances, but rather permanent rewiring of threat response pathways that made it extremely difficult for combat veterans to distinguish between situations requiring violence and those that should be resolved through communication or legal processes, particularly when confronted with betrayals that military culture conditioned soldiers to view as equivalent to combat treachery, requiring immediate decisive action to prevent further damage. The prosecution's expert, Dr. Sarah Chen, challenged every aspect of Bradford's testimony, emphasizing that while combat conditioning was real, it did not eliminate moral responsibility or conscious choice, particularly in situations where substantial time elapsed between stimulus and response. Chen presented research showing that even soldiers with severe PTSD retained capacity for deliberate decision-making, and that Daniel's actions demonstrated clear evidence of conscious choice rather than automatic trauma responses, including his decision to leave the bedroom and retrieve his weapon, rather than responding immediately with whatever might have been at hand. His systematic execution of both victims using professional military technique, and his calm behavior afterward, while waiting for police that indicated full awareness of his actions and their consequences. The testimony from Sergeant Michael Adams provided crucial context about Daniel's mental state in the months leading up to the murders, describing increasingly obsessive concerns about loyalty and betrayal that had dominated conversations during veteran reunions and social gatherings. Adams testified that Daniel had repeatedly expressed that betrayal by fellow soldiers or family members would be unforgivable, and that he could not imagine continuing relationships with anyone who violated the trust that he considered sacred, based on military values about loyalty between warriors. This testimony supported both prosecution arguments about premeditation and defense claims about psychological vulnerability, depending on whether jurors interpreted Daniel's statements as threats, indicating planned violence, or expressions of deeply held values that made the eventual betrayal particularly devastating. The financial testimony revealed that Emily had been consulting divorce attorneys and had begun separating assets in preparation for leaving the marriage, suggesting that she had been planning to end the affair's secrecy through legal dissolution of her marriage rather than continuing indefinite deception. Bank records showed that Emily had opened separate accounts and had been systematically transferring portions of her nursing income to savings that Daniel did not have access to, creating financial independence that would have enabled her to support herself after divorce. This evidence complicated victim narratives while also supporting prosecution arguments that Emily's plans were progressing toward legal resolution that would have avoided violence if Daniel had been willing to accept divorce, rather than viewing it as another form of betrayal requiring punishment. The testimony about Robert's relationship with Daniel focused on their military service together and the life-saving incident in Kandahar that had created the sacred bond Daniel believed Robert had violated through the affair. Fellow soldiers described how Robert had exposed himself to intense enemy fire to reach Daniel after he was wounded during an ambush, dragging him to safety while under continuous fire, and providing emergency medical care that prevented Daniel from bleeding to death before evacuation helicopters could reach their position. This testimony was designed to help jurors understand why Daniel had considered Robert's betrayal particularly devastating, not merely as loss of a friend, but as violation of a debt and bond that military culture considers more sacred than biological family relationships and absolutely inviolable under any circumstances. The defense attempted to introduce evidence about increased rates of violence among combat veterans with PTSD, hoping to contextualize Daniel's actions within broader patterns of trauma-related violence that society should address through enhanced mental health services rather than purely punitive criminal justice responses. However, Judge Harrison limited this testimony substantially, ruling that while general statistics about veteran violence might be relevant for sentencing, they could not be used to suggest that Daniel's specific actions were somehow inevitable or beyond his control given his military background, as this would effectively create a special legal standard for veterans that would undermine principles of equal justice and individual responsibility for criminal conduct. The testimony from Linda Walker, Daniel's elderly mother, was emotionally powerful as she described the son she had raised to be honorable and service-oriented, someone who had volunteered for military service out of genuine patriotism and desire to protect others rather than aggressive tendencies or inability to function in civilian society. Linda testified that Daniel had been fundamentally changed by combat experiences that he rarely discussed, but that clearly haunted him based on nightmares, hypervigilance, and social withdrawal that had worsened progressively after his return from Afghanistan. She described her son's efforts to be a good husband, despite his trauma and his devastation when she had visited him in jail, and he had finally broken down emotionally, expressing that he wished he had died in Afghanistan rather than surviving to become someone capable of the violence he had committed against people he had loved. The cross-examination of Linda Walker by prosecutors was respectful but firm, with Morrison establishing that Daniel had never sought professional mental health treatment despite documented PTSD symptoms, and that he had refused suggestions from family and friends that he consult psychiatrists or join veteran support groups that might have provided tools for managing trauma responses without violence. This testimony supported prosecution arguments that Daniel bore responsibility for failing to address his mental health issues, and that his choice to remain untreated despite obvious symptoms demonstrated negligence that increased rather than decreased his culpability for violence that might have been prevented through appropriate therapeutic intervention and medication management. The testimony from Daniel's former therapist, Dr. Elizabeth Martinez, was complicated by confidentiality issues, with the judge allowing limited testimony about Daniel's diagnosis and treatment compliance while excluding specific content from therapy sessions that might have revealed Daniel's mental state too extensively. Martinez testified that Daniel had attended only 5 sessions after his initial PTSD diagnosis before discontinuing treatment despite her recommendations for ongoing therapy and possible medication to manage symptoms including hypervigilance, anger issues, and intrusive combat memories that were interfering with his civilian life and relationships. This testimony supported prosecution arguments about Daniel's responsibility for his untreated condition, while also validating defense claims about genuine psychological impairment. The closing arguments phase began after 6 weeks of testimony, with both sides making final attempts to shape jury interpretation of complex evidence about military conditioning, psychological trauma, and criminal responsibility. Prosecutor Morrison emphasized the systematic nature of the executions and the substantial time between discovery and violence that had provided opportunity for alternative choices, arguing that Daniel's military training had made him more, rather than less responsible because it had given him enhanced capacity for controlled violence that he had deliberately chosen to employ against unarmed victims who had betrayed his trust, but had posed no physical threat requiring lethal response. Morrison argued that accepting the defense's PTSD arguments would effectively create immunity for combat veterans who committed violence, undermining justice principles while dishonoring the vast majority of veterans who managed their trauma without murdering civilians. Defense attorney Hartman's closing argument emphasized Daniel's distinguished military service, his documented PTSD, and the devastating nature of the betrayal he had discovered, asking jurors to consider whether society had adequately supported veterans struggling with combat trauma and whether Daniel's actions should be understood within the context of a broken warrior rather than a calculating murderer. Hartman acknowledged that Daniel's actions had been terrible and had destroyed multiple lives, but argued that his impaired mental state and trauma conditioning made him less than fully culpable for violence that emerged from neurological conditioning designed to keep soldiers alive in combat zones, but that became catastrophically maladaptive when triggered by civilian betrayals that his military-trained brain interpreted as threats requiring immediate elimination. The jury deliberation extended over 4 days, as 12 citizens struggled to balance sympathy for military service and trauma awareness, with recognition that accepting the defense's arguments might effectively excuse violence committed by veterans against civilians who had not threatened them physically. The deliberation room discussions revealed deep divisions between jurors who emphasized Daniel's PTSD and the devastating nature of the betrayal, versus those who focused on the premeditated aspects of his actions and the systematic execution style that demonstrated conscious control rather than automatic trauma responses beyond his capacity to regulate or redirect toward non-lethal alternatives. The verdict announcement on April 18, 2023, brought Daniel Walker back into the packed courtroom, where family members from all sides waited anxiously for the jury's decision about whether he would be convicted of first-degree murder, requiring life imprisonment, or lesser. Charges that might acknowledge his combat trauma and psychological impairment during the critical moments when he chose violence over alternatives. The jury foreman stood solemnly as Judge Harrison asked for the verdicts on both murder counts, reading in a steady voice that reflected the emotional difficulty of the decisions they had reached after days of deliberation about military service, psychological trauma, betrayal, and the limits of legal responsibility in cases where defendants had genuine mental health impairments but had also demonstrated capacity for deliberate choice and controlled execution of violence. The verdict on the charge related to Emily Walker's murder came first, guilty of second-degree murder rather than first-degree, indicating that the jury had found some merit in defense arguments about impaired mental state while rejecting claims that Daniel had been completely unable to control his actions or understand their wrongfulness. The verdict meant that jurors had concluded Daniel had acted with malice and intent to kill, but that the specific circumstances, including his PTSD and the devastating nature of discovering his wife's affair with his closest friend, had created sufficient emotional disturbance to negate the premeditation element required for first-degree conviction, though not enough to justify complete acquittal or reduction to manslaughter charges that would have implied the killings were somehow justified or understandable responses to provocation. The verdict on Robert Hayes's murder charge was more severe, but guilty of first-degree murder, with the jury apparently concluding that whatever emotional disturbance Daniel experienced upon discovering Emily's infidelity could not excuse his decision to also execute Robert, particularly given their military bond and the life debt Daniel owed Robert for saving him during the Kandahar ambush. The different verdicts on the two charges reflected the jury's complex reasoning about degrees of culpability and the limits of emotional disturbance defenses, suggesting that while they had some sympathy for Daniel's response to discovering marital betrayal, they could not extend that sympathy to cover his execution of the friend who had saved his life regardless of how devastating that friend's subsequent betrayal might have been. The sentencing phase began immediately following the verdicts, with both prosecution and defense presenting arguments about appropriate punishment that would balance Daniel's military service and psychological impairment against the severity of his crimes and society's need to hold individuals accountable for violence, regardless of their trauma histories or the provocations they experienced. Prosecutors argued for maximum sentences on both convictions, emphasizing that accepting trauma-based mitigation too readily would effectively create different justice standards for veterans versus civilians, and would dishonor the vast majority of combat veterans who managed their psychological challenges without resorting to violence against family members or friends who disappointed or betrayed them. The defense sentencing arguments focused on Daniel's military service, his lack of prior criminal history, his genuine psychological impairment from combat trauma, and the devastating nature of the betrayal that had triggered his violence, asking Judge Harrison to impose concurrent sentences at the lower end of the statutory range, while recommending placement in facilities equipped to address veteran mental health needs rather than general population prisons, where Daniel's PTSD and military background might make him vulnerable to exploitation or further trauma that would prevent any possibility of rehabilitation or eventual reintegration into society. The victim impact statements during sentencing were emotionally devastating, with Emily's mother describing the daughter she had lost and the grandchildren who would never be born because Daniel had chosen violence over divorce or legal accountability for his wife's betrayal. Maria testified about the permanent hole in their family and her struggle to explain to her own children how their aunt had been murdered by the man who was supposed to love and protect her, regardless of her mistakes or the pain her affair had caused. The statements emphasized that while Emily had made terrible choices in conducting the affair, her punishment should have come through divorce courts and social consequences, rather than execution at the hands of someone who had no legal or moral authority to serve as judge and executioner. Jennifer Hayes's victim impact statement focused on the destruction of her family and her children's loss of their father, emphasizing that Robert's mistakes in conducting the affair did not justify his murder, and that Daniel had destroyed not only 2 lives but multiple families through his decision to respond to betrayal with lethal violence. Jennifer described the particular cruelty of learning about her husband's affair only after his death, being denied the opportunity to confront Robert, process the betrayal, and make informed choices about their marriage, instead being forced into permanent widowhood through violence that had solved nothing, while creating cascading trauma across multiple families and communities. The sentencing testimony from military mental health experts provided context about the challenges combat veterans faced, reintegrating into civilian life, and the inadequacy of support services available to soldiers transitioning from environments where violence was not only acceptable but required for survival to civilian contexts where the same behaviors constituted serious crimes. Dr. Michael Bradford testified that Daniel's case illustrated systemic failures in how society prepared soldiers for return to civilian life, and that his violence, while legally inexcusable, represented a predictable outcome of sending soldiers into repeated combat deployments and then expecting them to seamlessly readjust to civilian norms without adequate therapeutic support or transitional services that address the fundamental neurological changes combat experience created. The prosecution's rebuttal emphasized that while veteran support services needed improvement, Daniel bore personal responsibility for refusing treatment and for choosing violence over the multiple alternatives available to him, including divorce, confrontation, or simply leaving the house to process his emotions before responding. Prosecutors argued that accepting defense arguments too readily would effectively excuse violence committed by any veteran claiming PTSD, creating dangerous precedents that would undermine justice while insulting the vast majority of combat veterans who managed their trauma without murdering civilians who had disappointed or betrayed them. Judge Harrison's sentencing decision reflected the complexity of balancing military service appreciation, recognition of genuine psychological impairment, and the need for accountability and proportionate punishment for taking 2 lives. For Emily's second-degree murder conviction, Daniel received 20 years to life in state prison, acknowledging the jury's finding of partial mitigation while ensuring substantial punishment for deliberately killing his wife. For Robert's first-degree murder conviction, Daniel received life imprisonment without possibility of parole for 25 years, reflecting the more severe jury verdict and the particular betrayal involved in murdering the man who had saved his life during combat. The sentences were ordered to run consecutively rather than concurrently, meaning Daniel would serve a minimum of 45 years before becoming eligible for parole consideration, effectively ensuring he would spend the rest of his productive adult life imprisoned for violence that had destroyed multiple families while solving nothing. Judge Harrison's statement accompanying the sentences acknowledged Daniel's military service and genuine psychological impairment while emphasizing that combat trauma, however severe, could not excuse or fully explain the systematic execution of 2 unarmed people who had betrayed his trust, but posed no actual threat requiring lethal response. The courtroom reactions to the sentencing were mixed, with Emily's family expressing relief that Daniel would spend decades imprisoned, while also feeling that no sentence could truly provide justice for their loss or compensate for the grandchildren who would never be born. Robert's family expressed satisfaction with the life sentence for his murder, while acknowledging that imprisonment could not restore their husband and father or undo the cascading trauma Daniel's violence had inflicted across their extended family and community. Daniel's mother, Linda, wept throughout the sentencing, telling reporters afterward that she had lost her son twice, once to the trauma of combat service and again to the prison system that would confine him for the rest of his life. The appeals process for Daniel Walker's convictions began immediately following sentencing, with his defense team arguing that the trial judge had made several reversible errors, including allowing prejudicial victim impact testimony, excluding relevant evidence about combat conditioning, and providing inadequate jury instructions about the relationship between PTSD and criminal intent that had confused jurors about the proper standards for evaluating Daniel's mental state during the murders. The appellate briefs emphasized that Daniel's case raised fundamental questions about how the criminal justice system should treat combat veterans whose trauma-altered neurology made them genuinely less capable of controlling violent impulses in situations their military-conditioned brains interpreted as threats requiring immediate decisive action. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals reviewed the case for 18 months before issuing a decision that upheld both convictions while acknowledging concerns about how the trial court had handled certain evidentiary issues and jury instructions related to PTSD and criminal responsibility. The appeals court ruled that while the trial judge might have provided clearer instructions about mental state requirements, the jury had received sufficient guidance to make informed decisions, and the verdicts were supported by overwhelming evidence of Daniel's capacity for conscious choice regardless of his psychological impairment, including his decision to retrieve his weapon, his systematic execution of both victims, and his calm behavior afterward, demonstrating full awareness of his actions. The prison experience for Daniel Walker was complicated by his veteran status and military background, which simultaneously earned respect from some inmates and corrections officers, while also making him a target for others who viewed him as representing oppressive government authority, or who sought to challenge someone with combat training to establish dominance within the institutional hierarchy. Prison records documented several violent incidents during Daniel's first 2 years of incarceration, including fights with other inmates that resulted in extended periods in administrative segregation where he was isolated from the general population for his own protection and to prevent further violence that would extend his eventual time served. The mental health treatment Daniel received in prison was more comprehensive than what he had accessed during civilian life, with regular psychiatric appointments, medication management for PTSD symptoms, and participation in veteran-specific therapy groups where he could process combat trauma and the murders with others who had military backgrounds and understood the challenges of reintegrating into civilian life after years of service. Prison psychologists noted that Daniel demonstrated genuine remorse for his actions for the first time during these therapy sessions, acknowledging that he had destroyed multiple lives, including his own, through his decision to respond to betrayal with violence, rather than pursuing legal remedies or therapeutic support that might have helped him manage his trauma. Responses. The relationship between Daniel and his mother, Linda, remained strong despite his imprisonment, with weekly phone calls and monthly visits that provided crucial emotional support, while also forcing both of them to confront the permanent consequences of the violence that had destroyed their family dreams and expectations. Linda's testimony during a parole advocacy hearing years later revealed that Daniel had expressed that he would give anything to undo the murders and that he wished he had sought professional help for his PTSD rather than believing he could manage the symptoms through willpower and determination alone, a tragic recognition that came far too late to prevent the deaths or restore the families his violence had shattered. The ongoing impact on Emily's family included complicated grief that mixed mourning for their lost daughter and sister with anger about the affair that had contributed to the tragedy, and with frustration toward Daniel for choosing violence over divorce or legal accountability. Maria testified during victim advocacy hearings that her family struggled with outsiders' suggestions that Emily had somehow deserved her fate or shared responsibility for the murders through her decision to conduct the affair, emphasizing that while Emily had made terrible mistakes in judgment, nothing she did justified execution at the hands of someone who had no legal authority to punish her betrayal through lethal violence. The Hayes family's recovery was complicated by the dual trauma of losing Robert and learning about his affair, with Jennifer struggling to help their children understand their father's flaws while also preserving positive memories and emphasizing that his mistakes did not justify his murder or negate the love he had demonstrated throughout their lives. Jennifer's participation in victim advocacy work focused on challenging narratives that suggested betrayed spouses had any justification for violence against unfaithful partners, emphasizing that infidelity justified divorce and emotional consequences, but never execution without trial or opportunity for explanation and redemption. The broader military veteran community's reaction to Daniel's case was deeply divided, with some veterans expressing sympathy for his combat trauma and arguing that the criminal justice system had failed to adequately account for the neurological changes combat experience created, while others insisted that military service did not excuse violence and that accepting trauma-based defenses too readily would dishonor veterans who managed their psychological challenges without harming others. These debates played out in veteran organizations, online forums, and policy discussions about how society should balance appreciation for military service with accountability for violence that veterans committed against civilians who had not threatened them physically. The policy discussions inspired by Daniel's case focused on improving mental health services for transitioning veterans, enhancing screening for soldiers, showing signs of dangerous psychological deterioration, and developing better therapeutic interventions, specifically designed to address combat conditioning that made violence too easily accessible as a response to civilian challenges. Legislative proposals included mandatory mental health assessments for soldiers returning from combat deployments, enhanced funding for veteran-specific therapy programs, and improved coordination between military and civilian mental health systems to ensure continuity of care for veterans transitioning from active duty to civilian life. The research initiatives funded partially in response to Daniel's case contributed to enhanced understanding of how combat experience altered brain function and decision-making capacity, with neuroimaging studies documenting that veterans with combat PTSD showed reduced activity in prefrontal cortex regions responsible for impulse control and moral reasoning when confronted with scenarios involving betrayal or perceived threats. This research supported arguments that combat trauma created genuine psychological impairments, while also emphasizing that these impairments did not eliminate moral responsibility or justify unlimited violence against civilians who disappointed or betrayed veterans in ways that triggered trauma responses. The educational programs developed for military personnel transitioning to civilian life included specific training about recognizing trauma symptoms, understanding how combat conditioning might create maladaptive responses in civilian contexts, and accessing mental health resources before psychological challenges escalated into violence or other destructive behaviors. These programs emphasized that seeking help represented strength rather than weakness, and that addressing mental health concerns proactively was essential for successful reintegration into civilian communities, where the same behaviors that ensured survival in combat zones constituted serious crimes requiring imprisonment and permanent separation from family and community. The 10-year mark after the murders brought renewed media attention to Daniel Walker's case as journalists and documentary filmmakers revisited the story and explored how it had influenced discussions about combat trauma, criminal responsibility, and the challenges veterans faced reintegrating into civilian society after years of military service in combat zones. The documentary coverage included interviews with surviving family members, legal experts, military psychologists, and Daniel himself, who had agreed to participate in film discussions about his crimes and their consequences as part of his ongoing therapeutic work and his desire to warn other veterans about the catastrophic results of failing to address mental health challenges before they escalated into violence. The interview footage with Daniel revealed a man fundamentally changed by a decade of imprisonment and intensive therapy, someone who demonstrated genuine remorse and psychological insight into how his untreated PTSD and rigid military value system had created vulnerabilities that the betrayal had exploited to trigger violence. He now recognized as inexcusable. Regardless of his trauma or the devastating nature of what he had discovered, Daniel's statements emphasized that he thought constantly about Emily and Robert, about the families he had destroyed, and about the alternative choices he might have made if he had been willing to seek help for his psychological struggles, rather than viewing mental health treatment as weakness incompatible with his identity as a disciplined soldier who should be capable of controlling his own responses through willpower alone. The parole eligibility that Daniel would face after serving 20 years for Emily's murder became a source of renewed controversy, with victim advocacy groups arguing that someone who had committed such calculated violence should never be released, while veteran organizations and criminal justice reform advocates emphasized that his genuine remorse, exemplary prison behavior, and extensive therapeutic progress demonstrated rehabilitation, that the parole system was theoretically designed to recognize and reward through conditional release under community supervision. The debates about Daniel's eventual parole consideration reflected broader societal divisions about punishment versus rehabilitation, and about whether combat veterans with PTSD should be evaluated differently than civilians who committed similar violence. The impact of Daniel's case on legal precedent included several appellate decisions in other states, citing his trial as establishing important principles about how courts should handle PTSD defenses in cases involving veteran violence, generally supporting positions that combat trauma might provide mitigation during sentencing, but could not excuse violence or eliminate criminal responsibility in cases where defendants had demonstrated capacity for conscious choice, deliberate action. These legal developments reflected judicial efforts to balance appreciation for military service with maintenance of equal justice principles that required holding all defendants accountable for violence, regardless of their backgrounds. Psychological challenges. The ongoing relationship between Daniel and his mother, Linda, provided the primary emotional support, sustaining him through years of imprisonment, with their weekly phone conversations and monthly visits offering opportunities to maintain family connections, while also processing the grief and regret that both of them carried about the violence that had destroyed their hopes for Daniel's civilian life and future. Linda's advocacy for improved veteran mental health services grew from her determination to prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies, though she acknowledged that no improvements in services could undo the deaths Daniel had caused or restore the years he would spend imprisoned for violence that had emerged from untreated trauma and devastating betrayal. The scholarship programs established in Emily's and Robert's names by their respective families represented efforts to create positive legacies from tragic deaths, with Emily's family funding nursing scholarships for students committed to trauma care, while Robert's family supported educational opportunities for children of military veterans who had lost parents to combat or combat-related psychological challenges. These memorial efforts reflected both families' desires to honor their lost loved ones through initiatives that might prevent future tragedies, while also helping others affected by military service and its psychological costs. The therapeutic writing that Daniel engaged in during his imprisonment included detailed journals exploring his combat experiences, his relationship with Emily, his friendship with Robert, and his psychological state during the months and moments leading to the murders. While these writings were primarily therapeutic tools for his own processing, excerpts were eventually shared with researchers studying combat trauma and reintegration challenges, contributing to enhanced understanding of how untreated PTSD and rigid value systems could create psychological vulnerabilities that betrayals might exploit to trigger catastrophic violence in individuals who had previously demonstrated no history of civilian aggression. The anniversary memorial services that Emily's and Robert's families held annually provided opportunities for processing ongoing grief, while also maintaining connections between relatives and friends whose relationships had been forged or strengthened through their shared losses. These gatherings included traditional remembrances, while also increasingly incorporating discussions about domestic violence prevention, mental health awareness, and the importance of seeking help for relationship challenges before they escalated into tragedies that destroyed multiple lives and created permanent devastation across extended families and communities. The policy changes implemented by the military in partial response to Daniel's case and similar incidents included enhanced mental health screening for soldiers returning from combat deployments, improved access to therapeutic services specifically designed to address combat conditioning and reintegration challenges, and better coordination between military and civilian mental health systems to ensure veterans received continuous care during the vulnerable transition period when they were adjusting to civilian life without the clear structure and strong social bonds that military service had provided. The research funding dedicated to studying veteran violence and developing better predictive tools for identifying soldiers at elevated risk of committing serious crimes during reintegration contributed to growing scientific understanding of how combat experience altered brain function and created lasting vulnerabilities that civilian society needed to address through enhanced support services rather than assuming veterans could seamlessly readjust to civilian norms without therapeutic assistance, specifically targeting combat conditioning and trauma responses. The victim advocacy work that emerged from both families' experiences included efforts to challenge cultural narratives that suggested betrayed spouses had any justification for violence against unfaithful partners, emphasizing that infidelity caused legitimate pain and justified divorce but never execution, and that accepting betrayal-based defenses too readily would create dangerous precedents, effectively excusing domestic violence based on relationship disappointments that should be addressed through legal separation and therapeutic support rather than lethal force. The educational initiatives targeting military families included programs designed to help spouses and children understand combat trauma, recognize warning signs of dangerous psychological deterioration, and access resources for protecting themselves and seeking help if veterans' behavior became threatening or violent, balancing appreciation for military service with realistic awareness that some veterans struggling with untreated trauma might pose genuine dangers, requiring intervention before psychological challenges escalated into violence. The transformation of Daniel Walker from decorated soldier to convicted murderer to prison advocate for veteran mental health represented a complex journey through guilt, psychological insight, and determination to create meaning from tragedy by warning other veterans about the catastrophic consequences of failing to address combat trauma before it destroyed lives and families. Daniel's participation in veteran-specific therapy groups within the prison system evolved into informal peer counseling, where he shared his story with newly incarcerated veterans, emphasizing that seeking mental health treatment was essential for successful reintegration, and that military values about strength and self-reliance became dangerous when they prevented soldiers from accessing therapeutic support for psychological challenges that willpower alone could not resolve. The letters Daniel wrote to Emily's and Robert's families expressing remorse and taking full responsibility for the murders were initially rejected by recipients who were not ready to engage with someone who had destroyed their loved ones, though over time some family members found that reading Daniel's expressions of genuine regret provided unexpected comfort and helped them process their complex emotions about the tragedy. Maria eventually responded to Daniel's letters, beginning a limited correspondence that helped both of them process their respective grief and anger, while also acknowledging the human complexity of situations where terrible violence emerged from genuine psychological impairment, devastating betrayal, rather than simple, evil, or callous disregard for human life. The parole hearing that Daniel would eventually face after completing his 20-year minimum sentence for Emily's murder became a source of intense preparation and anxiety, with Daniel working with therapists and legal advocates to prepare materials demonstrating his rehabilitation, therapeutic progress, and understanding of the factors that had contributed to his violence. The parole application materials included extensive documentation of his mental health treatment, his participation in veteran support groups, his educational achievements during incarceration, and letters from family members and supporters arguing that he had demonstrated genuine transformation and posed minimal risk of future violence if released under appropriate community supervision with continued mental health monitoring. The opposition to Daniel's eventual parole from victim advocacy groups and Emily's family members reflected their conviction that someone who had committed such calculated violence should complete his full sentence, regardless of rehabilitation progress, emphasizing that parole decisions should prioritize victim impact and societal safety over individual redemption narratives. These opponents argued that releasing Daniel after 20 years would minimize the severity of his crimes and send dangerous messages about accountability for domestic violence, particularly in cases where perpetrators claimed psychological impairment or provocation to justify or explain their actions. The broader societal discussions about Daniel's case continued evolving as public awareness of military trauma increased through media coverage of veteran suicide rates, homelessness among former service members, and the challenges soldiers faced reintegrating into civilian communities that often failed to understand or adequately support individuals whose combat experiences had fundamentally altered their psychological functioning and worldviews. These discussions balanced appreciation for military service with realistic acknowledgement that some veterans required extensive therapeutic support and that society bore some responsibility for providing adequate resources to address psychological damage created through military service in the nation's interest. The legacy of Emily Walker and Robert Hayes lived on through the people whose lives they had touched professionally and personally, with Emily remembered by former patients and nursing colleagues as someone who had brought compassion and skill to her work, while Robert was honored by students he had taught and soldiers he had served with as someone who had demonstrated genuine courage and dedication, despite the personal flaws that had contributed to the tragedy. The complexity of honoring individuals whose mistakes had contributed to their deaths, while also acknowledging that those mistakes did not justify execution, created ongoing challenges for families and communities seeking to memorialize them appropriately. The relationship between Daniel and the few friends who maintained contact during his imprisonment provided crucial emotional support, while also forcing those friends to confront their own complex feelings about loyalty to someone who had committed terrible violence versus condemnation of his crimes and sympathy for his victims. These friendships required constant negotiation between acknowledging Daniel's genuine psychological impairment and the devastating nature of his betrayal versus recognizing that his violence had been inexcusable regardless of provocation and had destroyed innocent lives along with the families who had loved Emily and Robert despite their fatal mistakes in judgment. The therapeutic insights Daniel gained through years of intensive treatment contributed to his understanding that his violence had emerged not merely from the immediate betrayal, but from years of untreated trauma, rigid adherence to military values that were maladaptive in civilian contexts, and his failure to recognize warning signs that his psychological functioning was deteriorating in ways that required professional intervention. This understanding, while genuine and hard-won, could not undo the deaths he had caused or restore the families his violence had shattered, though it might eventually contribute to preventing similar tragedies if Daniel's story reached other veterans struggling with comparable psychological challenges. The educational value of Daniel's case for military mental health professionals included recognition that traditional therapeutic approaches might be insufficient for addressing combat conditioning, that veteran-specific interventions needed to explicitly address how military training created automatic violence responses that could be triggered by civilian situations involving betrayal or perceived threats, and that successful reintegration required not merely treating PTSD symptoms, but fundamentally helping veterans develop new response patterns appropriate for civilian life, where violence was never an acceptable solution to relationship challenges or personal disappointments. The ongoing monitoring of veteran violence rates and factors associated with successful versus failed reintegration contributed to enhanced understanding that effective support required addressing multiple interrelated challenges, including mental health treatment, employment assistance, relationship counseling, and social connection opportunities that replaced the strong bonds and clear purpose military service had provided. Daniel's case illustrated that failure in any of these areas could create vulnerabilities that betrayals or setbacks might exploit to trigger catastrophic violence in individuals whose combat experience had made lethal responses to easily accessible when psychological resources for managing civilian challenges were inadequate. The policy recommendations that emerged from comprehensive analysis of Daniel's case and similar incidents emphasized prevention through early intervention, with military mental health professionals trained to identify soldiers showing signs of dangerous psychological deterioration and empowered to require treatment rather than accepting veterans' refusals of help. These recommendations reflected recognition that while respecting individual autonomy was important, society had legitimate interests in preventing violence, and that veterans whose psychological functioning suggested elevated risk might need mandatory treatment to protect both themselves and their families from tragedies that untreated. Trauma made increasingly probable as stressors accumulated and coping resources became depleted. 15 years after Daniel Walker murdered his wife Emily and his best friend Robert Hayes in a moment of devastating betrayal and uncontrolled rage, fueled by untreated combat trauma, His story continues to resonate in discussions about military service, psychological responsibility, the limits of trauma-based legal defenses, and society's obligations to veterans struggling with reintegration challenges that civilian populations often fail to understand or adequately address through policies and support services. The case established important legal precedents about how courts should handle PTSD defenses, while also inspiring enhanced mental health services for transitioning veterans and greater awareness about the neurological changes combat experience creates, and the therapeutic interventions required to help soldiers adapt these combat-honed responses to civilian contexts where violence is never acceptable. The families destroyed by Daniel's violence have each found different paths through their grief, with Emily's mother and sister becoming advocates for domestic violence prevention, while emphasizing that infidelity never justifies murder regardless of psychological impairment or the devastating nature of betrayal. Robert's widow, Jennifer, has focused her advocacy on supporting children who lost parents to violence, working to ensure that these young people receive adequate therapeutic support and financial assistance, while also honoring their deceased parents' positive qualities, despite the mistakes that contributed to the tragedies that took their lives. These advocacy efforts represent attempts to create meaning from senseless deaths, while also preventing future families from experiencing comparable devastation. Daniel Walker's transformation during 15 years of imprisonment has included genuine psychological growth, demonstrated remorse, and commitment to warning other veterans about the catastrophic consequences of failing to address mental health challenges before they escalate into violence. His upcoming parole eligibility, after completing 20 years for Emily's murder, will test societal willingness to balance rehabilitation recognition against victim impact concerns and questions about whether someone who committed such calculated violence should ever be released, regardless of therapeutic progress. The parole board's eventual decision will reflect broader cultural values about punishment versus redemption, and about whether combat trauma should influence release decisions for veterans who committed serious violence against civilians. The legislative changes, inspired partially by Daniel's case, have improved mental health screening and treatment access for transitioning veterans, though significant gaps remain in services available to soldiers struggling with reintegration challenges. The military's enhanced focus on mental health has reduced stigma around seeking help, while also creating better coordination between military and civilian treatment systems. Though many veterans still resist therapy due to cultural values emphasizing strength and self-reliance that make acknowledging psychological struggles feel like admissions of weakness incompatible with military identity and the warrior ethos that sustained them through combat deployments. The research contributions emerging from analysis of Daniel's case and similar incidents have advanced understanding of how combat experience alters brain function and creates lasting vulnerabilities that civilian society must address through enhanced support rather than assuming veterans can seamlessly readjust without therapeutic assistance. Neuroimaging studies have documented specific brain changes in combat veterans that help explain increased violence risk, while also identifying protective factors including social support, meaningful employment, and therapeutic interventions that help veterans develop civilian-appropriate response patterns to replace combat conditioning that makes violence too easily accessible in situations that trigger trauma responses.